Welcome to the final Golden Beer for the year, and also Eliza and Zaha's birthday party somehow.
Happy birthday! Happy birthday to you! Happy birthday, dear Lou! Happy birthday to you!
Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Saint Mary McKillop.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you.
So we're just getting someone to take care of the music. Okay, so as I said, this is the final Golden Beer for the year, and Andrew Vaccaro just pointed out to me it's also the 40th Golden Beer that we've had in the 4 years that it's been running now. We've had 40 Golden Beers, which seems amazing. We've had so many. And we're finishing the year on a high note. We've got Dr. Paul Morrissey, President of Campion College, I would say Australia's premier Catholic university, here to speak to us about the 5 great books that every Catholic should read. Just to give you a little bit about Dr. Paul Morrissey, as I said, he's been President of Campion College for over 10 years now, and before that he was a lecturer at Notre Dame University in Sydney, and before that he was a secondary teacher here in Melbourne, so he's a hometown boy. Studied theology at the Sacred Licentiate in Theology at the Lateran University in Rome, which is kind of like, that's the best university you can go to just about to study theology, so that's pretty good. But most importantly, Paul is a terrific bloke, and he's a wonderful father with his wife of 9 children.
Is that all?
Try and beat that with a stick. The youngest of whom is 2, he just mentioned to me. That's pretty amazing. So, Paul's going to talk to us about the 5 books that every Catholic should read. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much, John. Speaking of wonderful fellows, John is certainly that, and it's a great pleasure to call John a friend. And it's great to be here. I think John has tried to get me here before, in these last few years. So it's great to finally make it here. In fact, I used to live just down the road for a few years when I was teaching at Campion College. I lived in Notting Hill, so this is my local. So it's great to be back here at the Notting Hill Hotel. To be with you at Golden Beer. And I was in Sydney, we used to have theology on tap, which I spoke at, which was, I guess, a similar thing, theology in a pub. But Golden Beer sounds a bit rougher, doesn't it? Rough around the edges. And I was thinking maybe I should get prepared for, a bit of, people throwing glasses, they don't agree with you, or throwing bottles. And I don't know if you've seen The Blues Brothers, but it's still a great film, The Blues Brothers. Not that theological, but there are nuns in it, and they are on a mission for God. And at one stage they're performing, and the crowd's getting a bit restless because they wanted some country and western, not blues. So they were behind a net, and people were just throwing bottles at them. So I was half prepared for a net here tonight, but only half. I know I'm in good company, and hopefully you won't throw too many things at me. So, I've been asked to talk about 5 books that every Catholic should read. Yes. So, now 5 books, it's pretty hard to just talk about 5 books. And so what I'm going to start by saying is I'm not going to include the Bible. Now, that may be because I'm Catholic and we've got a stereotype for Catholics that we don't read the Bible. But I don't want to discourage you from reading the Bible. So the Bible is the most important book. There's a lot of books in the Bible. So park that to one side. Definitely read the Bible. So you should read the Bible. That's the first thing I'll say. But I'm going to talk about a few other books. But I'm going to talk really about more than 5 because I can't stop at 5. But I'll talk in a bit more detail about 5 and then I'll add some others. If I spoke about 5 books tomorrow, that'd be almost different, probably, because there's just so many books I think everyone should read. And it's great to have some young people here in the audience, probably celebrating a birthday, I think. Is that right? Yes, with the young people, which is great. So maybe I should include a little children's book, but I'll try to think about that as we go. What do you think about that? She's nodding at me. Just lovely. She's got beautiful ears. So, all right, let's start. Now, this one's a bit of recency bias for me because I gave a lecture on this book about 3 weeks ago for our first year literature students, and it's St. Augustine's Confessions. So, obviously, it's quite a famous book in the Catholic or Christian, in fact, the Western tradition, written by St. Augustine. St. Augustine sort of was the 300s to 400s, 4th and 5th centuries, and an incredible life which is captured, at least half his life is captured in this book, bless you. And the Confessions, I had the task really, because I was going to lecture on it, to reread it. The first time I read the Confessions, I was in my early 20s, and I was on a retreat. And I just took it along. I thought, oh, apparently this is an important book, I'll take it with me, and there's a lot of time for quiet and prayer. So I read it over the weekend, and I was really touched by it, surprisingly, because often you can hear that a book's really important or good, and you start reading it, and you ask, why is it important or good? But I was really touched by it. Touched by it because it's a magnificently written book. It is a classic of Western literature, but also it's so contemporary in a way. Augustine internalises his life. So it's sometimes said it's the first autobiography written. In a certain sense that's true, but it's not a typical autobiography because it's a prayer. The whole book is a prayer. Augustine speaking to God in prayer through a deep reflection about his life. A real heart-to-heart. And he really does pour out his heart to God as a sinner. Very, very beautifully. And so I was really touched then, and I was touched again, rereading it recently for this class I was going to give. This time I was struck again by how contemporary it is, particularly in an age when, a big word, particularly for our young people, is identity. This whole book is about Augustine trying to find his identity. And it's only when he really meets the Lord that he understands who he is. And it takes him a while. So you're probably aware, right at the beginning of Augustine's Confessions, at least some of you would be aware, is a famous quote, translated more or less along the lines that, "O Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. That my identity is only going to be found until it rests in the Lord. Until I find the Lord and live my life for the Lord. That's when I'll be happy." So, a lot of the great thinkers of the tradition, even pre-Christian thinkers, saw happiness, fulfillment, as the key question of human life. So Aristotle, famously, a pre-Christian Greek philosopher, he has a big section in his work speaking about happiness. What makes us happy? In fact, every decision we make in our life, he says, is based on this idea, will I be happy? So Thomas Aquinas also bases or begins his whole section on ethics by this question: what is happiness? What will make me happy? That each and every human life is really the pursuit of happiness, the seeking of fulfillment, and most of our life we seek it sincerely, but often in the wrong way. And for Augustine, that's a definition of sin. We're seeking that fulfillment, that happiness, but in a wrong way. But that's what we're motivated for. So Augustine's Confessions is a magnificent, very personal description of this pursuit of happiness that he finds. There's lots of other things about the Confessions that I really love too. And it's very modern, very contemporary. The importance of friendship. Augustine was a people person. He loved to speak to people, to learn from people. So when he was seeking the truth, he sought it from philosophers, from thinkers. There's a lovely little anecdote in the Confessions where Augustine is really seeking to be happy, and he thinks, in a worldly sense, he's really happy because, he was classically trained by his parents, who, really sacrificed for his education. He ended up going to Rome, and then in Rome he was appointed to go to Milan and become really the most important public intellectual in Milan. So he'd made it. And yet he was walking along with some friends, and then he saw this sort of beggar on the street. And the beggar's there, and he's a bit drunk. Augustine talks about he's had a lot to drink. And he's very happy. He's had a drink, he's just had some food, this beggar, and he's sort of dancing around on the street. And Augustine looks at him and he tells his friends, look, this guy is happier than I am. And look at him, he doesn't have anything. It was part of Augustine's moving towards the truth. He was seeking happiness in a worldly sense, both in terms of fame, but also in terms of pleasure, famously for Augustine. Only will he find it in the Lord, ultimately. Another beautiful passage in the book of Augustine's book, the Confessions, is his conversion. So by this stage, he's really basically believes that in the faith, he believes in Jesus, mostly through the very holy Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, also classically trained, incredible intellect. And Augustine really resonated with his sermons of Ambrose. And anyway, so Augustine is struck by Ambrose. He's in a garden, and in the garden he's actually weeping in the garden with his friend. He's just weeping. Why is he weeping? Because he just can't feel he can make that step to faith. He can't really say yes to the Lord. He believes that his heart just won't move in that direction. Mostly because of his life of sin. Anyway, in the garden he hears a voice of a child. Tolle lege. Take up and read. Tolle lege. Just repeating it. So Augustine's thinking, what's that? Can't see any child. So he finds the nearest book he has, which is the Bible, and he opens it up to Romans chapter 12. And then he reads, the first lines he reads is about giving up his old ways. Giving up the old ways of sin and putting on Jesus Christ. And that moment, he converts. So again, very personal, very real sort of conversion. And a magnificent description. The other thing I'll mention about the Confessions is the beautiful role that St. Monica plays in the Confessions. So St. Monica, Augustine's mum. And what an inspiration for all mums, St. Monica is. This last winter, I was in Rome on a pilgrimage with the Emmanuel community. There's a couple of people here tonight who are with me, and we were staying very close to the Augustinian Basilica in Rome, which is a magnificent basilica, but quite hidden away close to the Piazza Navona. And in that basilica, it's a magnificent basilica, very hidden. And in it there's a Caravaggio painting, there's a fresco from Raphael of the prophet Isaiah, and then tucked away in a side chapel is Saint Monica, who died in Ostia, and you read about it in the Confessions, in the port city of Rome, near Rome. And her remains were brought to Rome and placed in this church. It's a beautiful chapel. And, you know, I was very moved to pray at Monica's tomb. And then rereading Monica's role in Augustine's conversion. It's so magnificent. And at the end of book 9 of the Confessions is the beautiful description of Monica's death, where Augustine's with Monica as she dies and goes to her eternal reward. So there you go, Augustine's Confessions. Very much a book I think that every Catholic should read. Probably won't, not every Catholic, but I highly recommend Augustine's Confessions. All right, the second one that I want to talk about is a novel. And this is a novel, probably the first really Catholic novel I read and enjoyed. So there's lots of novels I could choose here, really. But I thought I'd talk about this one tonight. And that's a novel called Brideshead Revisited. So Evelyn Moore's famous novel, Brideshead Revisited. Who's heard of Brideshead Revisited?
Yeah.
Book? Yeah, most of you. So a good Catholic audience. Now Evelyn Moore, what a character he is. So Evelyn Moore, famous English author of the 20th century, and a Catholic convert. Definitely no saint, maybe in heaven, but he was a very cantankerous and not a pleasant fellow, but a great writer, tremendous writer. And Brideshead Revisited is his great Catholic novel. He wrote other Catholic books, so he wrote a biography of St Edmund Campion, patron saint of Campion College. He wrote a great biography of the wonderful English priest called Ronald Knox. He wrote a lovely sort of historical novel of Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine. But his other books were written mostly before his conversion. So books like Vile Bodies, A Handful of Dust, Scoop. And then there's another wonderful trilogy, perhaps my favourite of Evelyn Moore's books, semi-autobiographical about his time in the Second World War, called the Sword of Honour, Sword of Honour trilogy. Magnificent. And when I was reading that for the first time, I would just burst out laughing quite often. My wife was quite worried about me because of how much I was laughing. It was very, very funny. But anyway, Brideshead Revisited. Why do I choose this one? Well, one, for a sort of Christian-themed novel. It's very short, so there. If you don't want to read a Dostoevsky or a Tolstoy, Brideshead Revisited is a lot shorter and a little bit easier, I would say. But it's a story about grace. A story about grace. It's a story about a fairly dysfunctional Catholic family in England. And the title of the book is The Home of this family, Brideshead. So you can see the Catholic overtones even of that, the Bride of Christ, head of the church, Brideshead. It's a story of this, as I said, somewhat dysfunctional family, separated parents, Lord and Lady Marchmain, and their 4 children who are just so different. With Bridie, the very strict Catholic, and Cordelia, the lovely, pious, beautiful girl, Julia, the wayward girl, and then Sebastian, who's in some ways the principal character of the book, and how he's touched by grace but in mysterious ways. And the narrator, in some ways, is Evelyn Moore himself, a little bit. Again, there's a bit of autobiography in there. as Charles Ryder. And it's really how this somewhat dysfunctional family, Catholic, is touched by grace, mysteriously, supernaturally. And there's a chapter in the book just called A Twitch on the Thread. And this is an image really of grace. That you know how God's grace is imperceptible, isn't it? God's grace is there all the time. But often we don't realise it's there. It's like a little twitch on the thread. It's a little thread connecting us to the Lord, and these twitches, just come back this way a little bit. And all these characters are like that. They're sort of coming back little by little through a twitch on the thread. Again, it's magnificently written, very evocative, but again, deeply Catholic novel. And again, the first time I read it, I was just very, very touched. I've read it many times. It was also made into a very faithful and, I think, terrific adaptation by the BBC as a mini-series. And when it came out, I think it was sort of late 70s, early 80s.
81.
1981. It was the biggest TV show in the country, and certainly in England, but also in Australia. I still remember that being a massive TV series. At the time I didn't know it was Catholic, but it is very faithful to the book and well worth checking out the series. All right, so that's the second one. So Augustine's Confessions, Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. What I should mention, I was going to mention too, Augustine's autobiography. There's a couple of other great Catholic autobiographies that I'd recommend to you. And one of them is The Story of the Soul, so Saint Therese of Lisieux. What a book that is. Very different than Augustine. Very pious, but very real. That's why she's a doctor of the church, is that little book. So Story of the Soul. And the other one, which is a lot more dense and more theological and more difficult, would be St. John Henry Newman's, now Doctor of the Church also, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, is the account of his conversion to Catholicism. So there's sort of three there, but Augustine's Confessions, Story of the Soul, and Newman's autobiography. Novels, there's so many, isn't there? And I mentioned, the Russian writers, they can't keep God out of their books, so get stuck into those if you're brave enough. Has anyone ever had a go at the Brothers Karamazov? Yeah, there's a few, that's good. A lot of people start, but you've got to be in a really philosophical mood and theological mood to get through. But obviously there's lots of great Catholic books, and in 20th century, great Oxford writers too. I'm going to speak about C.S. Lewis in a minute, but obviously Tolkien as well. And Lord of the Rings. Have you read Lord of the Rings, you guys? Yeah, The Hobbit? No? You sure? Great Catholic book too. You don't have to be embarrassed by it. Just read it. All right. A third book. This book, probably a lot of people may not know this book, but I'm just going to say it because I think it's a really good introduction to Catholicism. It's a relatively recent one. In 1969, Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict, wrote a wonderful book called An Introduction to Christianity. And I absolutely recommend that. I was going to put that in the top 5. Terrific book. And he wrote that as a university professor in Germany at a time when the universities were really going crazy. I mean, they still are crazy. But it was the start of their craziness in the late 60s. So he thought, I need to write a defense of Christianity. And that's what he did in the context of German universities in the late 60s. Terrific book. About 5 years ago, an American Dominican wrote a similar sort of book called An Introduction to Catholicism. And this Dominican's name is Thomas Joseph White. So he's a young Dominican priest. He's now the rector of the Anglican University, the Pontifical University in Rome. And this book is excellent as an introductory defense of Catholicism. Magnificent. And he wrote the book, his motivation for writing it, so he was a convert, or is a convert. He was studying at Brown University, which is one of the Ivy League universities in America. He's a brilliant young student there. But he felt like his life was sort of going nowhere. He could almost do anything he wanted because of his intellect. Very personable, excellent musician, but a little bit like Augustine. He thought, what's really going to make me happy? Anyway, he started reading the books of Flannery O'Connor, the great Southern Catholic writer in America, who had also put in the top 5 here too, but we don't have enough room. But if you wanted some good sort of American Gothic short stories that are Catholic, highly recommend Flannery O'Connor. Anyway, Flannery O'Connor helped bring Father Thomas Joseph White into the church. And he is doing some incredible work in theology and in what I'd loosely term apologetics, but in a university setting. So he and some Dominican confreres have started up a whole movement within secular universities of giving talks about Catholic faith, philosophy and theology. So he's motivated out of that to write this book. And it is, I think, the best introduction to the faith that I've read. Light of Christ, an introduction to Catholicism by Thomas Joseph White. And why I think it's the best, again, it's a bit of recency bias. Sometimes it's good to have something that's quite contemporary. He takes seriously the real questions that science has, modern science has, about the faith. Because one of his principal areas of interest as a theologian is the engagement with contemporary science. So he really does that. But he's also highly literate in terms of read very widely. So he touches on all sorts of novels, of writings. And not only that, he's a great banjo player. And he's part of this terrific group band. And again, I highly recommend this band called the Hillbilly Thomists, a group of Dominican friars. And they are, I'm serious, they're an extremely popular band, bluegrass band in America. Youngins, look up Spotify. Do you know what Spotify is? Yep, they certainly know what that is. Look up the Hillbilly Thomists, and you'll love it. They are fantastic. So they write their own music, but also standards of the American South, and really terrific. So Thomas Joseph White, An Introduction to Catholicism, The Light of Christ. Highly recommended. Again, it's a bit unusual, it's not very famous, but the Archbishop in America, Archbishop Chaput, said this was, on a par with Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, which is obviously a massive praise. All right, so how many is that? Is that 3? 3. All right, I'm going to have to select.
You smuggled a few extra ones in there.
I have smuggled a few in, yes. There were 3 main ones. 3 main ones. All right, and what? All right, yes, C.S. Lewis, I mentioned. So C.S. Lewis, famously not Catholic, but doesn't mean we shouldn't read him now. Where's our children, our young ones? Where have they gone? Oh, you're back there. So C.S. Lewis, the Narnia Chronicles, okay? It's in the thumbs up. I'll read those. I have to recommend something. Yes. So C.S. Lewis is most famous for his Narnia Chronicles, the children's books, which are wonderful, and also a Christian allegory. But he also wrote a lot of explicitly Christian books and books of the day in terms of commentary of the day. My favourite C.S. Lewis book is The Abolition of Man, which is it's basically a lecture he gave. It's only about 40 pages, so if you want to choose the shortest book here this evening, that's it. The Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis was asked to give a broadcast lecture on the BBC about education. And he took up that challenge. And it is the best little book I know of about modern education and its pitfalls. And he wrote it in the 40s. He sort of predicted really what was going to happen. He said it was already happening there. And this first little chapter, it's entitled Men Without Chests. And he said the public education system in England was raising men without chests. In other words, men without any substance. He said education was falling into a grave situation of relativism, that there was no real truth, there was no real moral order, no objective beauty about things. And so in these 40 pages or so, Lewis magnificently destroys this sense of modern education. And at the same time gives a defence of the traditional moral law, or natural moral law, and gives examples of natural moral law from around the world, from different traditions. As I said, it's a terrific book, a terrific argument that he makes, and one I return to again and again, particularly in terms as an educator. I think it's magnificent. But C.S. Lewis wrote other books that I absolutely love too. The Screwtape Letters, which is a funny but very spiritually accurate description of how the devil works his way into our life and tempts us. The Four Loves, which is a beautiful expose of the four loves classically understood through the classical tradition but also the Christian tradition. And his famous defence of Christianity, Mere Christianity. And again, for a popular work of apologetics, it is truly magnificent. So C.S. Lewis, highly recommended all those books, but particularly for tonight, The Abolition of Man. All right, the weekend before last, I had the great pleasure of seeing John up in Sydney at the annual G.K. Chesterton Society Conference. And I thought, gee, I better mention a Chesterton book for this, so I will. Then I do have another book I want to talk about, so maybe it'll be 6. Actually, the 6th book is a book about books, so that doesn't count. So this one, Chesterton. So everyone, has people heard of G.K. Chesterton? Just not. Yeah, so even the young ones here have heard of G.K. Chesterton. So Chesterton is one of the great characters of Catholicism. Again, 20th century English Catholicism was very, very rich, with a lot of converts, a lot of writing converts. So I've already spoken about one, Evelyn Moore. Another famous one, Graham Greene. And G.K. Chesterton is another famous convert to Catholicism. So Chesterton was a journalist. That was his trade, and a great journalist at that. But he was more than that. He was a cartoonist, a drawer, a poet, a novelist. You name it, he sort of did it, did G.K. Chesterton, and did it with great wit, humour and good grace. He engaged in all the great debates of the day, made friends of his enemies, famously with George Bernard Shaw, the great playwright and writer, an atheist, and an all-round terrific guy, G.K. And the book that I want to mention tonight, and I could talk about a lot of different G.K. Chesterton books, my favourite G.K. Chesterton book is The Everlasting Man. And it's not as famous as, say, Orthodoxy, which is his sort of great work of Christian apologetics, I would say. But The Everlasting Man is, I think, his most philosophical book, most thoughtful book, still full of his many sort of very quotable lines and paradoxes. There's not a lot of academic rigour in G.K. Chesterton, but it's sort of almost thoughts exploding on the page. The Spectator magazine, which is the longest or the oldest magazine in the world, at the time of that G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man was published, it said every page deserves a review of its own. And I think that's a really apt description. Because every page you read it, you go, wow. The first half is about the human person and the dignity of the human person. And the second part is about Jesus Christ and who Jesus Christ is. And in many ways, the everlasting man forecasts the great Christian anthropology we have at the Second Vatican Council, and particularly in the pontificate of John Paul II. Done in a very different way, less theological and philosophical, but a similar spirit. That the truth of the human person is only found through the truth of Jesus Christ, or the question that every human person is only answered by Jesus Christ. And GK gets this in The Everlasting Man. Wonderful book. A little bit denser than some of other GK's works, but I absolutely love it and highly recommend it. All right. What's the time?
10 past.
A heap of time. Gee, that's dangerous. All right. 5 more minutes? 5 or 10? All right, what I'll do in the next 5 or 10, I'm going to talk about a book about books, which I love, which I would normally perhaps put in this top 5, but I didn't. And then I might mention a few other notable ones, or authors that I really like. So this one is by a Jesuit priest who's not long died a few years ago, long-time professor of politics at Georgetown University, James V. Shaw. And he's a real character priest. He had a patch on one eye, not because he was a pirate, but because he had something with his eye. But I think he probably didn't need to wear this patch after some sort of developments in medicine, but I think he enjoyed having a patch. So it was a bit of a statement for him. But anyway, he wrote lots and lots of books, but he wrote one book, and I do need to read this from my notes because it's so long. I hope I wrote this down. I won't remember it otherwise. All right, here we go. So, he wrote, the main title of the book is, so bear with me, is Another Sort of Learning. Another Sort of Learning. And this is the subtitle of the book. I'll read it out for you. Selected contrary essays on how to acquire an education while still in college or anywhere else, containing some related advice about how to employ your leisure time when ultimate questions remain perplexing in spite of your highest earned academic degree, together with sundry lists nowhere else in captivity to be found. So that's the title of the book. And it's a lovely book of sort of short chapters about life and about big questions, and then he just provides lists of books to help you read about those books, about those ideas. So it's perfect for something like, if you're interested in this sort of topic, he's got lists and lists of books you should read on big questions. It's a great book. And if you think, oh gee, I didn't get the education I should have had, just get that book, Another Sort of Learning, and you can just work your way through all the books in it, and all the and his wit and wisdom. Again, he's a Chestertonian sort of writer, magnificent writer. He wrote literally hundreds of books, James V. Shaw, and apart from being a great academic in political philosophy at Georgetown over many decades. Highly recommend it. All right, some honorary mentions. I've already talked about Flannery O'Connor, but I do really recommend her to you. There was a film made of her just recently, last year, by Ethan Hawke, directed it and had his daughter in it, playing Flannery O'Connor. And she died very young. She would have been probably one of the greats of 20th century literature if she didn't die so young. Notwithstanding that, she's still acclaimed as one of the great American writers of the 20th century. And what a writer she was, and what a Catholic. And she mixed in all the sort of literary circles and was proudly Catholic. At one dinner party, someone came up to her and said, one of the authors of the day, it was in New York, and said, "Oh, Flannery, I find it so delightful, you're Catholic and it's so nice, but that Eucharist thing, it's such a lovely symbol, isn't it? And she goes, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. That was how she was. And her fiction is just larger than life. And don't go to it thinking it's going to be sort of romantic sort of fiction. It's really violent and quite in your face about how God's grace can even work through serial killers and all sorts of people. So you need a potentially strong stomach, but highly recommend her short stories. I haven't mentioned Thomas Aquinas, though I probably should. Mostly because it's hard to just pick up Aquinas and read a book of Aquinas, and so that's why I didn't mention him. But I do want to mention a book about Aquinas, because we all should read something about Aquinas. I think being sort of such an important figure in the history of Catholic thought. And the book I recommend is by a French Dominican priest, and it's not that old, it's probably 15, 20 years old now, by Jean-Pierre Terrell. It's actually a 2-volume work, but you can read the second volume, which is the best. It's just called Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master. And it's a really lovely biography of Aquinas, but of his thinking, and again, makes it really come alive. So there's so many books about Aquinas, including Chesterton's, which is great. A bit less academic, but lovely nonetheless. In fact, Chesterton's getting sidetracked here, but Chesterton has a great account in his book on Aquinas of a dinner, which may or may not have happened. Unlike Augustine, we know nothing about Aquinas, really. Augustine loved to write about himself. Aquinas wrote nothing about himself. But apparently there was a dinner between Saint King Louis, who was a saint of France, and Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was invited to this dinner, and G.K. writes about this dinner. And I was so taken by this dinner, we named our fourth son after it, Louis Thomas. So a nice hyphenated name to join these two great saints together. I'm really getting sidetracked here. John mentioned Chesterton's Aquinas, but there is so many on Aquinas. But Jean-Pierre Terrell is terrific. And then John Paul II obviously wrote a lot of great encyclicals that are definitely worth reading. But 2 I think are really important. One is Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. Again, so challenged today, this relationship, and he, in really a magnificent document, brings these two, in the world, very separate things together, and so necessary to bring them together. So Fides et Ratio. And his other book on moral theology, or moral philosophy, The Splendour of Truth, Veritatis Splendor. And the other book associated with John Paul II is Witness to Hope, so George Weigel's wonderful biography of John Paul II. That is really a history of the 20th century through the lens of John Paul II. And I just saw it on the shelf this morning. It's like, oh, that should be top 5. So I mention it now. Another writer who I really like, I don't always agree with, but I find as such an important figure too, historical figure of 20th century Catholicism, is Jacques Maritain. So the French layman, philosopher, but very involved in a lot of the big historical and philosophical and theological debates of the 20th century. And a very holy man. Married to Raisa Maritain, a Russian Jewish emigre, and Jacques Maritain. The reason why I really love the Maritains is they are so modern. So they were at the Sorbonne together, studying atheists, pretty hip, and they make this pact. If we don't find the meaning of life, within 12 months, we'll commit suicide together. Wow.
As you do.
As you do. So they took their intellectual life seriously. So they meet some French Catholics, including Charles Péguy, the French writer, Catholic writer, and Léon Bloy, another French writer, and they convert within that 12 months, thankfully. And they go on to be tremendous thinkers and, using modern terms, you've heard the term influencers? Yeah, influencers in French society. And I really do love Jacques Maritain. He wrote a book towards the end of his life called The Peasant of the Garonne. And it's a wonderful book reflecting about his life, but particularly about the moment in the church just after the Second Vatican Council, and he was really quite worried about it. And if you want to sort of go back in time to look at what was happening at that time and a real intellectual's take on it, it's a great book, The Peasant of the Garonne. And there's another one of my favourite books is a book about Jacques Maritain, written by the American philosopher Ralph McInerney, who was for many years the professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And he wrote a little book called The Very Rich Hours of Jacques Maritain. And it's a magnificent little book about the life of Jacques and Raissa Maritain, so such key figures. Many other books I can talk about, but I'm going to leave it there. Is that okay, John? John's giving me the thumbs up. So anyway, thanks for your patience, and hopefully you have some material there to read. What do you think? At least The Hobbit.
Thanks so much, Paul. We might do a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has anyone got a question for Paul?
I was just wondering about, I wrote about translations, especially of confessions. Like, is it one better than another?
I'm not an expert on the translations confessions, but the one I have is written by, remember the name, it's such a funny name, and it is apparently a very good translation, and that's the Penguin edition. It's translated, I don't know the first name, but his surname is Pine-Coffin. Pine-Coffin. So it's an easy name to remember, but it is apparently a very good translation.
Briefly mentioned J.R. Tolkien. Are you able to just expand on your thoughts in relation to the trilogy and the Hobbit?
Yeah, I suppose I'm not a big sort of fantasy sort of person usually in terms of books or film or so on. But what I love about Tolkien's world and his inspiration and really what he's saying, because it's not an allegory as such. So Tolkien famously said of C.S. Lewis books that there's too much allegory in there. You know, we talked about the Narnia. It's too obvious there, Clive, what you've written. So he preferred to keep it a bit more ambiguous, but no less Catholic. And I do like that, because I guess that's a bit of the Catholic sort of sense of the sacramental. And we don't want to make it too obvious. I don't know if people are fans of those sort of very, the American sort of Christian films, which are really direct and in your face. And yeah, they have a part to play and so on, but for me they're a bit too sort of in your face. I prefer a little bit of subtlety. And Tolkien's fantasy world is more subtle, but nevertheless very Catholic. And there's a real Catholic vision and imagination there. And I'm no expert on it, but I have read and heard Joseph Pearce, the English but now American literary scholar, talk about this, and you can see his lectures online. And they're terrific, how he goes into the importance of the dates, the types that each of the characters represents, the different Christ-like figures in the world of Tolkien, and so on and so forth. But for me, the most striking thing is obviously sin, represented by the ring. And really that's original sin, this thing we all have. It's a thing we want, we desire, and we think it'll make us happy, but it actually destroys us, it destroys God. And so on, this ring of power. It's again this false sense of seeking happiness and the need to destroy this sin through an act of self-sacrificial love. So very powerful. And I think, look, the films have their critics in some ways, but I really enjoyed them. And so they're pretty faithful to the Hobbit, perhaps less so, but certainly the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I think, is a film. Have you seen the films?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. And they're pretty faithful to them. I'm going to get sick of me picking on you. But yeah, definitely recommend. But again, probably not my real sort of area of love is sort of fantasy world so much.
You said at the start of the night, Paul, that you were worried about, this is not working, is it? You said you were worried about, people might throw some objects if they weren't happy. Well, it's good you mentioned the Lord of the Rings, because I think my girls would have thrown a few chairs at you.
Oh, I was lucky.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm sorry.
You're in charge.
I was going to ask, I've heard that the church used to have a list of forbidden books that they told people not to read.
The index.
The index of forbidden books, yeah. I was wondering, what do you think about that? Like, that's almost a list of books Catholics shouldn't read. Do you think there's a place for saying stuff like that, or is that something that we, maybe it was a mistake that to say these books are forbidden for whatever reason? Maybe it's better not to sort of ward people away from those books. But the second question I was going to ask related to that is, are there any books you'd recommend people, don't read? Maybe they're sort of books that are popular, but you read them and you thought, you know what, that's not worth your time.
Okay. So the index of forbidden books, yeah, I wouldn't be a big fan of bringing that back. Probably not a great PR exercise, if nothing else. It'd probably make them more popular. And to be frank, I don't quite know the historical context behind it, so I don't want to say too much. But certainly, if we look at the history of the church, there's different periods related to cultural moments. So, those post the Reformation wasn't very ecumenical age. It was wars of religion and heretics, and it was pretty wild and violent, which we just don't recognise now. But I wouldn't go back to that and say, well, that was crazy. I mean, that was of the time and place, and there was a certain sense to that. And I dare say there was a certain sense behind the index and a reason behind it, but I just don't quite know what it is. And I wouldn't necessarily bring that back, no. In terms of books not to read, well, there's lots of books not to read. I would steer clear of anything, and this is just a general thing, but if you go to a bookshop, most books in the bookshop are probably pretty bad. So that would be a general rule. So if you go to and again, there's fewer and fewer bookshops, but you say you go to Dimmicks, is Dimmicks still around? Yeah. If you go to Dimmicks, you're probably 70% of the books I wouldn't necessarily go near. So be wary of most books, I would say, and look for recommendations. Popular books that I read that I really couldn't recommend. Again, I'm very, I can say discerning, but it sounds like I'm being a bit arrogant, but discerning in the sense I will rely on recommendations or a review of someone I think I can trust or a topic I think is worthwhile looking at. I wouldn't sort of waste my time picking something up. I quite like a good detective novel that I know is going to be trashy. I'll read it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to anyone. It's just sort of escapism, really. So there's nothing really leaps at me. Again, if you're going to avoid things going into a bookshop, doubly avoid the religion section. So, really go in there with warning bells everywhere there. Occasionally you'll find something in the whole religion sections that's good, probably written by C.S. Lewis or something. But other than that, it's pretty, not just grim, it's probably very threatening to one's eternal salvation.
Can you write all these names down and put it in the links?
Great idea, yeah. We'll send in an email, we'll send a list of
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I do have another one that's, I just jumped to my mind there. This is a book, a reasonably recent book, probably written 15 or 20 years ago, by Marilyn Robinson, called Gilead. So Marilyn Robinson's an interesting lady. She's a bit heretical in her views, but she's Christian, not Catholic. But Gilead is just a tremendously Christian, beautiful book about an old Presbyterian pastor and his wife and a child. He's an old dad, very old dad, a bit like me, and he's dying, and he's basically reflecting on what he needs to write to his daughter. And it's very, very Christian, and orthodox Christian book. Like, it's beautifully written and very, very moving. And I was very surprised reading it. I sort of picked it up. Someone mentioned it to me, saying it's a good book. It was endorsed by Barack Obama. So I'm not sure I'll take this one on. But I read it and I was just very moved. And it was orthodox. I mean, it's written from Presbyterian perspective, but it was beautifully, old school sort of Presbyterian orthodoxy, but it was beautiful. It's a beautiful book. So there you go. It's another recommendation.
Greg Sheridan's just put out some new books. Have you read, I think it's the third of the...
Yeah, the third one of Greg's, yeah. So he was at the Chesterton conference last week. I haven't read the third one. I've read the first two. In fact, Greg's a great fellow. He's a great friend of Campion College. In fact, the first book of that trilogy, in fact, every book has Campion in it, but the first one, he has a chapter on Campion, which we're very indebted to him for. And before the book came out, he published it in the Australian, which was very helpful for us. So Greg's a terrific fellow, obviously foreign editor of the Australian, but he's more interested in Christianity these days, because he's been at the Australian so long. They don't mind him writing about religion as well, because they're the most popular of his articles. So he's written these three books. First one was more about sort of introducing God as an idea and then interviews. The second one was about Christ and then interviews, and the third one, sort of the early church and then interviews. So that's how he structures the book, as sort of a bit more of a reflection on the topic, and then he just interviews people who are trying to live it out. And he interviews some really terrifically interesting people across different, branches of Christianity, but all orthodox in their own way. Yeah, I think they're really great works, and particularly as they're in Australia, set in Australia, there's the sort of books you can give as gifts that are not too sort of in your face, but readable, interesting, because they interview sort of famous people about their faith, and so I've given them as gifts as a great way to evangelise in a certain sense.
Time for one more if there's another question.
I'm just wondering, I'm a little bit surprised, a book like the Catechism you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I didn't put the Catechism in, not because I don't like the Catechism, or I don't believe in the Catechism. Mostly because it's more a statements of belief. And it's not like your old school catechism, which were literally statements. So it's more theologically rich and well worth reading, obviously. And so if you're going to read a book of theology to introduce, in that sense, the faith, the catechism definitely. The book I mentioned before, Introduction to Catholicism, takes a different approach because it's more personal exposition based on the tradition. Probably more readable, whereas the catechism is sort of headings and paragraphs and so on. So that's more why it's now. Could certainly be on a list like this. Certainly every Catholic should read it. If we're basing it on that, you are spot on. Sorry, main comment.
Could everyone give Paul a hand, please? Sorry, it seems like every time I touch a microphone, the batteries run out. Yes, that's another one.
John.
I don't know what I'm doing.
John.
Right, just a few quick announcements. We've got a couple of donation buckets that are going to come around in a moment. If anyone would like to help us thank our speaker and to support God and Beer, we'd be very grateful. It's optional. Girls, would you mind helping us? Yeah, we'd be very grateful for your support. Paul's flown down here from Sydney to give this talk, so we'd really love to give him a generous thank you for doing that. God and Beer obviously is an initiative of the Knights of the Southern Cross, and this is a great Catholic lay men's organisation, which I encourage everybody, all the men here, if you're interested in joining, to come and talk to Andrew or Kevin
or Lawrence.
Lawrence about the Knights of the Southern Cross. If you want to just jump back, yeah, I mentioned Paul Morrissey is the president of Campion College. As I said, this is the best Catholic university. ACU and Notre Dame, obviously the large and better known ones, and they've got some very good things there as well, but I think this is really the best one. This is where I'd love to send my kids one day. If you haven't heard of it, look into it. They've got a great website, tells you all about it, or come and talk to Paul. He'll tell you all about it as well. The Australian Catholic Youth Festival is coming up in 3 weeks. It's going to be a huge event. I believe 5,000...
6,000 registered.
6,000 young Catholics from around Australia are going to come to Melbourne for that. If you know anyone of
You guys coming?
Between...
Yeah.
The Knights will have a stall at the ACYF near the entrance.
The Knights will have a presence there. If you know any young people in the age bracket, I think it's 16 to 25 years of age who might be interested, let them know. Videos and photos, we video God and Beer, we take some photos. We usually put those on Facebook and use them for promoting the event. If anyone doesn't want to be in those photos, if you don't want your image used, just let Andrew know, he'll take care of that. Symbol on the Catholic Faith, this is a great course being run by Jeff and Eliza and Zaha at St. Gerard's Dandenong North on Thursday nights. Encourage you to go along and enjoy that. Dr. Edward Shree, who was one of our God and Beer speakers from earlier this year, he's the, it's a course being presented by him. And we'd like to thank the Catholic Development Fund for supporting God and Beer. They have a website where they don't just Catholic Development Fund is often associated with funding schools and Catholic hospitals and things like that, but they also can help out individuals with their banking needs. And Andrew, have you got the slideshow there? There should be one more slide in the gap slideshow.
No, I don't have that one.
Okay. The last thing I was going to mention is the Harkaway Hills Christmas Market, which is happening on Saturday the 6th of December. That's the school where my kids go, and it's going to be an amazing day. I believe they're going to have 2,000 plus people there and over 100 stalls. It'll be really, really cool. And girls, what's the best stall going to be there?
Of course, yours. What's it?
The girls are going to be making some Japanese crepes, so don't miss that.
Oh, great.
Did I forget anything?
Did you have the flyers for that?
You can send the digital flyers.
Okay.
Thanks everyone. See you next year.
And don't forget,